I showed up at my grandfather's apartment unannounced, and when he opened the door, his face was white as a sheet. He grabbed my arm, pulled me inside, and whispered in a trembling voice, "Go to the kitchen, get under the table, and don't make a sound." I thought he'd lost his mind, but I obeyed. Then I heard my husband's footsteps in the hallway. What he said over the next 40 minutes destroyed everything I thought I knew about my own life. I was 40 years old when my life split right down the middle. It wasn't loud. It wasn't infidelity discovered on a cell phone or a screaming match with plates being thrown. It was silent, calculated, like a crack beneath the floorboards that slowly creeps up until the ground caves in. And when it caved in, I was crouching beneath an antique mahogany table in my grandfather's kitchen, trying not to breathe too loudly. My name is Samantha. I'm an accounting assistant at a mid-sized firm in downtown Denver. For 12 years, I was William's wife. 12 years. Enough time to build habits, memories, a whole life of routines you don't realize are life itself until they disappear. The smell of his dark roast drip coffee every morning at 7, always black, no sugar. The way he folded his towel after showering, always in perfect thirds. I truly loved him. That has to be said because it makes the pain easier to understand. I met William at a company holiday party. He'd tagged along with a colleague, stayed in a corner with a craft beer, watching people with this quiet, observant air I mistook for depth. Within 4 months we were dating. 2 years later we married. He worked in commercial sales, repping industrial equipment. Sometimes he traveled, but he always came back with funny stories or a gas station souvenir, always wearing that smile that made me forget I'd been alone for 4 days. My grandfather Walter was the only real family I had left. My mother passed when I was 22, cancer, fast and brutal. My father walked out when I was 16. My grandfather was my anchor, the only fixed point around which my life revolved. Grandpa Walter was 74, living alone in a condo he and my grandmother had bought in the 80s in Cherry Creek. Older, solid brick building, thick walls, massive windows. My grandmother died 11 years ago. Since then, he lived there with the same photos on the walls, the same dark wood furniture, the same smell of fresh coffee and little lavender sachets he kept in the drawers. Just because my grandmother used to do it, and he never broke the habit. It was a large place for one person. 3 bedrooms, spacious living room, kitchen with a solid mahogany table that could seat 8. Prime location, high floor overlooking a park, the kind of property worth a lot of money. Highly privileged asset, any real estate appraiser would say. I never thought of it as an asset. I thought of it as the house where I learned to bake apple pie, where I slept on the couch during summer vacations, where Grandpa Walter called me the day my mom died and told me I could cry as much as I needed because he wasn't going to hang up. William thought differently. It just took me too long to realize it. The first red flags were so subtle I mistook them for kindness. During our 2nd year of marriage, William started visiting my grandfather more frequently without me asking, bringing fresh fruit or donuts, sitting in the living room talking about baseball, politics, how the city used to be. My grandfather liked him. Said William was a good guy, polite, attentive, different from younger generations who didn't know how to listen to their elders. I should have paid closer attention to the types of questions William was asking. At the time I thought it was natural curiosity. Only later did I understand he was gathering intelligence. By our 4th year of marriage, William started bringing up the condo during dinners. Always indirectly. Always with the tone of someone being reasonable. "Sam, your grandpa's getting older. That place is too big. Imagine if he falls or gets sick while he's alone." I agreed it was a legitimate concern. Suggested hiring a home health aide or having him live with us. William would shake his head as if I was missing the point. He escalated little by little. Talked about putting the condo in both our names to protect the family asset. Suggested getting power of attorney to help with paperwork. Mentioned he had a buddy who was a real estate agent, could appraise the place just so we knew the market value. I stopped him at all those proposals. I've worked with numbers for years. I know when the math doesn't add up. Something inside me refused to swallow those suggestions as simple family courtesies. William wouldn't push in the moment. He'd change the subject, stay quiet. I'd assume the matter was dead. But it would return weeks later, repackaged. What I didn't know was that while I was closing the door at home, William was opening another one directly at my grandfather's apartment. Grandpa Walter told me months later exactly how it went down. William would show up on weekdays, afternoons when he knew I was at work, bring pastries, cheese, good coffee, sit in the kitchen with my grandfather, talk about trivial things. At the end of the visit, almost as an afterthought, he'd pull out some paper for my grandfather to sign. Authorization to receive mail, contact update form for the HOA. Things that seemed administrative, routine, no consequence. My grandfather signed the first few. He was 74 but completely sharp. Retired state auditor with 32 years of service. He knew how to read documents. It was just that his trust in his grandson-in-law fogged his vision, like steam on a mirror. Until the day William brought him a different piece of paper. My grandfather put on his reading glasses, read the first line, read the second, and stopped. Asked William to explain what it was. William explained vaguely, rushing his words. Said it was a legal formality. All properties in the county were going through an update in the public registry. My grandfather told him he was going to keep it and read it carefully later. William got anxious, insisted he needed the document back that same day. My grandfather said no. William snatched the paper back and left without saying goodbye. That night, my grandfather called his lifelong friend George, a retired real estate attorney. Read the document to him over the phone. George stayed silent for a few seconds, then said with the calm voice of someone who's seen it all, "Walt, that's a quitclaim deed. If you sign that, you're transferring the title of your home entirely over to him." My grandfather hung up, sat in his kitchen chair for a long time, staring at the table where my grandmother had served dinner for 40 years. He didn't call me right then. Didn't want to scare me without being absolutely sure. After all, he'd been an auditor. He spent 2 more months gathering information, noting dates, saving papers, consulting with George. When he finally had the complete picture, he made a decision. He was going to wait. And when William came back, he was going to record everything. I knew none of this the afternoon I went to my grandfather's house, unannounced. I went because I had this heavy tightness in my chest that hadn't gone away for days. A murky feeling that something was wrong. I went because I needed strong coffee and honest, comfortable silence. The kind you only find in the home of someone who's known you since the day you were born. When my grandfather opened the door and went pale, my first reaction was thinking he was having a medical emergency. But his eyes weren't the eyes of someone in physical pain. They were the eyes of someone who's afraid yet fiercely determined. That strange combination that makes a person look fragile and dangerous at the same time. "Sam, get to the kitchen right now, under the table, and don't make a sound." He whispered it, grabbing my arm, yanking me inside before I'd even fully crossed the threshold. I obeyed. I didn't ask questions. Something in his tone left no room for them. The mahogany table in my grandfather's kitchen was massive. When I was a little girl, I could almost stand up straight underneath it. Now at 40, I had to pull my knees to my chest and press my back against the cold wall to fit. It smelled like old wood and faint floor wax. The kind my grandfather stubbornly polished the floorboards with every month, just as my grandmother had taught him. I stayed perfectly still, my heart racing at 1,000 miles an hour. The doorbell rang less than 3 minutes later. I heard my grandfather walk slowly down the hall, the shuffle of his slippers on hardwood, the click of the deadbolt. The door opened. Then I heard a voice I knew better than my own. "William." "Walter, good afternoon. I brought you some treats." His voice was exactly the same as the one he used with me during our early years. Smooth, careful, with that studied calmness I'd confused with confidence. My grandfather told him to come in, that he was going to put water on for coffee. I heard William's heavy footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards under his weight, the rustle of a paper bakery bag being set on the living room table. My grandfather walked through the kitchen toward the stove, very slowly. As he passed the gap where I was hiding, he tilted his head down slightly without stopping, without turning his face, and said, barely moving his lips, "He doesn't know you're here. Stay." One word. Stay, and I stayed. The first few minutes were entirely banal, the kind of chit-chat that makes you doubt your own instincts. William asked about blood pressure, doctor's appointments, if the new medication was working. My grandfather answered calmly, giving absolutely no hint someone was curled up in his kitchen listening to every syllable. Then the tone shifted. Not a sudden jump. A gradual descent, like when temperature drops and you only realize it when you're already shivering. William started talking about the property situation, maintenance costs of an older building, the burden of keeping up such a large home without help. His voice was losing its smoothness, becoming drier, more direct. "Walter, I need you to understand I'm trying to help you. All this bureaucracy is Sam's fault. She has zero vision for wealth management. She doesn't understand business, never has. But I do, and I know what needs to be done." I pressed my back against the wall harder, felt the cold plaster through my blouse. My grandfather replied slowly, with the tone of someone in no rush because he knows time is on his side. Said he understood his concern, appreciated him looking out for him, but that the condo was his, and any decisions regarding the place would be made by him alone. William raised his voice slightly. Not a yell, worse than a yell. That low, controlled voice of someone suppressing rage with immense effort. The kind that slips out when the mask has worn too thin to hide what's underneath. "You're being stubborn, Walter. I have very serious debts. Debts that affect Sam too, even if she doesn't know it. If you would just help me right now, I could fix everything. The condo would be secured, Sam be safe, and nobody would have to find out about any of this." I had to use every ounce of willpower not to move. Serious debts that affect Sam too. My grandfather stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he asked, using his old auditor voice, the one that spent 30 years untangling lies buried in spreadsheets, "What debts are those, William?" and William started talking. I heard things from under that table no wife should ever have to discover that way. But maybe there was no less brutal way to find out who William really was. He'd taken out loans from at least 4 different shady financial lenders over the last 3 years. Skimmed over the figures. But it was enough to calculate the total was well over $150,000. He'd invested that money into shares of a commercial real estate project that went completely bankrupt. According to him, his partners had faked the appraisals. Now his creditors were coming after him. Some had already filed lawsuits. For at least one of those loans, he'd used our own condo as collateral. The home we bought together on a mortgage. The one concrete thing I thought we'd built in 12 years of marriage. I found that out crouched on the cold floor, my chin trembling. But that wasn't the part that broke me inside. The part that shattered me into a million pieces was when my grandfather asked him directly, "And Sam, what did you plan to do with her in the middle of all this?" It took William about 2 seconds to answer. When he did, his voice was completely different. All that forced smoothness was gone. What remained was a coldness I'd never heard from him before. Sharp and precise, like the edge of a straight razor. Sam was never the plan, Walter. The plan was always the apartment. I needed someone who was the heir to a valuable piece of real estate. Someone who trusted me enough not to ask too many questions. She served that purpose well for a long time. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. For me, it lasted a lifetime. I bit my own fist. Not from anger, but from a pain that doesn't have a proper name. That agonizing realization that what you called love was in reality just a strategic position on a map you never even knew existed. 12 years, every morning breakfast, every trip. Every night he came home late, and I swallowed my complaints because I wanted to be the understanding wife. Every time I defended him to my best friend Amanda when she said something seemed off. Every decision I postponed. Every dream I put on the back burner so as not to pressure him too much. All of it had been calculated by him as an investment. I was just the stepping stone to get to my grandfather. My grandfather remained quiet after those words. Then he spoke with that deep, deliberate voice of a man who doesn't need to raise his tone to be heard. "Then I need you to understand one thing, William. This apartment is not going to be yours. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. But what you just told me, that's officially on the record." William asked him what he meant by that. That was when I heard the sound. A tiny, discreet sound coming from somewhere on the hallway console table. A little click. My grandfather had started a voice memo recording on his cell phone before William walked in. William had just confessed to everything. William realized he'd said too much. I heard the immediate panic in his voice, his desperate attempt to backtrack, words tumbling out in a rush. Claimed he'd misspoken, that he was under insane pressure, the debts weren't letting him sleep, that the truth was he really did love Sam. It had all just sounded wrong. My grandfather didn't respond to a single excuse, stayed absolutely silent, possessing that serenity that had always been his trademark. The calm of a man who spent decades listening to people try to explain away math that didn't add up, learning that silence is far more effective than any confrontation. That was when I crawled out from under the table. It wasn't a planned decision. My body acted before my brain could process it. My knees ached, my back was stiff, my face was soaked with tears I hadn't even realized I was shedding. I stood up, straightened my posture, and walked into the archway of the living room. William was standing in the middle of the room. When he saw me, his face rapidly cycled through emotions. Shock, terror, that reflex attempt to smile that died before it even formed. He opened his arms in a welcoming gesture that looked entirely rehearsed. I didn't say anything right away. I stared at him for one long second. Looked at the man I'd slept next to for 12 years, whose shirts I still laundered, whose struggles I'd accepted without question. I felt something very strange. Not hatred. A kind of cold, total clarity. Like when a thick fog suddenly lifts and you finally see the landscapes exactly as it's always been. I heard everything, I told him. My voice came out steady. That surprised me. He started trying to explain, to minimize, to reframe it. Said he'd exaggerated, that he was hot-headed, that I'd taken things out of context. I let him ramble for a few seconds. Then I told him very calmly that I hadn't taken anything out of context, that I worked with numbers, that I knew how to verify information, and that in fact I'd already mentally verified quite a bit. Mentioned the lenders, the debts, our condo being put up as collateral behind my back. William's face completely fell apart. His last attempt to look soft vanished. My grandfather, who'd remained sitting quietly on the sofa this whole time, stood up slowly, walked over to the console table, picked up his phone, and turned the screen toward William. On the screen was the voice recorder app, the timer still ticking, over 50 minutes of audio. William took a sudden step toward my grandfather, fast, aggressive, his hand reaching out. In that movement there was a violent urgency that made me instantly tense up. That was when George stepped through the front door, which my grandfather had left unlatched. George, 72 years old, retired lawyer, holding a walking cane he didn't actually need but carried purely out of habit. He had the posture of a man who spent decades being the highest authority in a courtroom. He'd been standing out in the hall, listening, having coordinated with my grandfather from the beginning. He looked at William with absolute calm and said very slowly, "Son, I heard everything from the door, and I've had the district attorney's personal cell phone number saved in my contacts since 1993. You take one more step and I'm calling him right now." William froze, looked back and forth between us. Me, my grandfather, George. Then he snatched his jacket off the back of the chair and stormed out without another word. Slammed the door so hard, flecks of paint chipped off the door frame. We listened to his footsteps rushing down the stairwell until they disappeared. George locked the deadbolt and engaged the chain. My grandfather sat back down on the sofa with his slow aging knees. I walked back into the kitchen, gripped the edge of the sink with both hands, and finally broke down, not screaming, just silently, my shoulders violently shaking, the tap water running aimlessly because I'd turned it on without realizing it. My grandfather came into the kitchen, sat in the nearest chair, and put his hand on my shoulder. He stayed just like that, not saying a word while I cried out everything I'd been holding in beneath that table. His hand was warm and heavy and smelled like those same lavender sachets as always. The very next day, I was at family court before 8 a.m. filed the divorce papers, while still wearing the same coat from the night before, still with a smudge of floor wax on the elbow. William called me that same day, then the next, and the one after that. I answered the first few. He fluctuated wildly between a meek pleading voice and a sharp hostile one. Between "I'm so sorry" and accusations. Between "I love you, we can fix this, and you're going to regret crossing me." After answering 3 times, I stopped. Started saving every voicemail, every text, taking screenshots with time and date stamps. My coworker Brenda, who'd spent 20 years handling the financial side of messy divorces, helped me compile a sworn affidavit with the entire log. It all became legal evidence before William even realized he was building the case against himself. Then the creditors started calling. Unknown voices, sometimes aggressive, sometimes just utterly exhausted, saying William had promised to pay them as soon as he sold a property. I told every single one the exact same thing, never altering my tone. I am not a guarantor for my husband's obligations. We are in the middle of a divorce. All collections must be directed to him or handled through the legal system. Most of them hung up. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 months later. William showed up with a young, arrogant attorney who tried to get the recording thrown out, arguing it was a violation of wiretapping laws and invasion of privacy. My lawyer, Susan, a woman in her late 50s, with the kind of commanding voice that makes a whole room stop to listen, explained with surgical precision that the recording had been made by my grandfather inside his own private residence, on his own device in a situation where he was facing extortion regarding his property. It wasn't unlawful surveillance. It was legitimate self-defense of an elderly man documenting elder financial abuse and threats. The judge admitted the recording into evidence. The divorce decree was issued. I got to keep our condo, taking into account that William had hidden massive debts, fraudulently leveraged marital assets behind my back, and proven in his own recorded words that his intentions in the marriage were fundamentally fraudulent. He appealed the decision and lost. The creditors eventually tracked him down on their own. With no access to any property, no verifiable income, and no partner left to believe his lies, William was left completely alone to carry that crushing weight. One of the lenders repossessed his car. His friends slowly distanced themselves as the full story leaked out. A few months later, I heard he'd packed up and moved out of state. I didn't care to know anything more than that. The first few weeks after the divorce were the strangest. I'd come home to my 2-bedroom condo and didn't recognize the silence. Before, the silence was tense, the kind that sits around waiting for something bad to happen. Now it was different. Expansive. The kind of silence where you can take a deep breath without feeling like you're bothering someone. I started noticing little things about myself that had vanished without me realizing. That I actually preferred my morning coffee with milk, not the black drip coffee I'd adopted out of pure habit. That I loved sleeping with the bedroom window cracked open even in freezing Denver winter. That I didn't need to ask anyone's permission to go visit my grandfather on a random Wednesday night. Small stuff, but all those tiny details added up to an entire life I'd been living for 12 years. The first real step I took was securing my grandfather's apartment. I went over there with a folder full of legal documents and my laptop. We sat down at the mahogany kitchen table, the exact same one I'd huddled beneath during the most defining 50 minutes of my life, and we worked for 2 days straight. We drafted a living trust and a life estate deed with an attorney, guaranteeing his absolute right to live there for the rest of his life, updated all property paperwork, regularized the title, registered the property in the county's real estate fraud alert system. Now any attempted transaction or lien placed on that apartment would trigger an immediate alert to my phone and email. George paid us a visit while we were sorting the papers out. Looked at the table covered in documents, looked at my grandfather with his reading glasses perched on his nose, reviewing every clause, looked at me crossing tasks off a checklist with my pen. He said, with the brevity of an old dog who's seen it all, well, now things are finally exactly as they should be. Later, while we were drinking coffee, he added something that stuck in my head for weeks. Sam, how many women do you think are out there who've gone through the exact same thing as you but don't have your background? Who don't even know where to begin? Who don't have a grandfather sharp enough to trap a predator on tape? How many elderly folks are sitting alone in their homes, terrified of their own family members and have no idea what to do with that fear? I kept thinking about that at work. At the accounting firm, there were 2 associates who occasionally handled family estate protection cases. I heard them every day talking about cases identical to mine, but looking at them from the outside, treating them as case files, as numbers, as folders. I looked at those stories and finally understood them from the inside. 8 months after my divorce was finalized, I quit my job, opened my own consulting firm focused entirely on asset protection, financial literacy, and legal advocacy for seniors and their families. I found a tiny office space on the ground floor of a commercial building, renovated it myself with the little savings I had left, painted the walls as a warm beige, bought a very plush, comfortable sofa for the waiting area, specifically chosen so my elderly clients could sit without their joints aching. On the front door, I hung a simple brass plaque with the firm's name, and below it the words, Asset Protection and Elder Rights Advocacy. Word-of-mouth recommendations among older women are more effective than any multi-million-dollar marketing campaign. One woman told her neighbor. The neighbor told her friend at water aerobics. That friend mentioned it to her daughter-in-law. Within 3 months, I was seeing 4 to 5 clients a day. My grandfather would sometimes come spend the afternoon at my office. He'd sit on the waiting room sofa, drink the fresh coffee I always kept brewing, flip through a magazine, or just sit quietly watching me. He never said out loud what I could clearly read in his eyes when he watched me work. When I was patiently explaining dense paperwork to an elderly woman who'd walked in shaking with anxiety. When I was aggressively arguing on the phone with a title company to untangle a mess for a client who didn't know their left from their right. I saw his look, and it was the kind of gaze worth more than 1,000 words. One night, after locking up the office and turning off the lights, I called him from the sidewalk outside, asked him if he remembered the day he'd yanked me inside and ordered me to get under the kitchen table. He laughed. That short, dry chuckle of a man who's lived long enough to laugh at serious things. I asked him how he'd even come up with the idea to hide me there instead of just telling me to leave. He went quiet for a second. Then he told me it had been very simple. When he saw me standing in the doorway, he knew I needed to know the truth, but not from someone else telling me. I needed to hear it straight from the mouth of the person who was hiding it from me. If I had just told you the story, you probably would have doubted me. But if you heard it with your own 2 ears, there was no way you could ever doubt it. So I let you listen. I stood in silence outside my office, looking up at the brass plaque illuminated by the street lamp. Thanks, Grandpa. For what? For the table. For it being big enough for me to fit underneath. He laughed again, and I laughed with him. For the first time in a very long time, I laughed in a completely light-hearted way, without feeling like I had a heavy anchor tied to my throat. I hung up, slipped my phone into my coat pocket, and walked toward my car. The air was crisp. It smelled like wet asphalt and rain, that unmistakable scent of late evening in a sprawling city that never stops moving. And I walked slowly, with no rush, with nowhere I needed to escape to and no one I needed to hide from. It was just me, the night air, and a life that had finally truly begun to belong to me.